Welcome to the Global Journalism Seminars. This is The Briefing. From the First Nations of Canada to the Amazonian tribes of Brazil, from the Khoisan of South Africa to the Sami of Norway, Finland and Russia, Indigenous stories span the globe, yet a clear pattern emerges in journalistic treatment of them: oversight and stereotypes. When we surveyed our journalist fellows, 69% described reporting on Indigenous affairs in their regions as very poor. And in a pool representing 15 countries, the stereotypes were depressingly prevalent. 44% have identified suggestions of criminality in reporting on Indigenous nations. 38% pinpointed insinuations of substance or alcohol misuse, and 19% highlighted hints of low work ethic. In this seminar, we'll meet Saskatchewan Cree journalist Connie Walker, producer and host of Stolen: Surviving St. Michael's. Her Pulitzer and Peabody Award-winning podcast tells the story of how she investigated the sexual abuse her own father sustained at a residential school in Canada. We'll ask how Indigenous affairs reporting has improved and what challenges remain. That's The Briefing. Let's begin.
Hello and welcome to everyone who's joined in from all across the world for this conversation. You've heard some of what we're going to discuss, so I'm not going to go into a long preamble, only to say we are absolutely delighted to have the very, very brilliant Connie Walker join us today. And for more reasons than one, which is that you're up at 8 a.m., which I admire and respect. Connie, thank you very much for making time for our chat. So much of what we're going to discuss is, I hope, going to unpack itself over the course of the next hour. But for those who are probably walking into this, and I'm assuming there would be some people who would like a bit more context of what we're discussing, tell us a little bit about this podcast in the sense of what the school residential system was and why you chose to tell the story.
Sure. I'm so happy to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation. And I'm not a morning person, but I did not mind at all getting up this morning to join you. So I'm thrilled that you are all making space for these conversations. I think that everything in the video really echoes my own experience in journalism in terms of the coverage of Indigenous people in Canada and the US. I grew up on my reserve from a small reserve in Saskatchewan called the Okonee First Nation. And although I have residential school survivors on both sides of my family, it really was not something that was ever talked about. It's not something that we learned about in schools. But in fact, residential schools were open for over 100 years in Canada, and there were over 100 residential schools across the country. And the goal, quite simply, was assimilation. The government wanted to assimilate Indigenous children. So it was a deliberate policy to separate them from their parents and their families and their communities. And at the beginning, it was mandatory attendance that First Nations children as young as 4, 5, and 6 years old were forced to leave, often forcibly removed with the help of the RCMP, and sent to these residential schools that were funded by the government and often run by the churches. And most of the residential school churches in Canada were run by the Catholic Church. And they were not allowed, for many, including my father, who attended in the 1960s, many, English wasn't their first language. They didn't know any English at all when they arrived, but they were forbidden from speaking their language. They were subject to physical abuse. And what we've learned since the last residential school closed in 1997 was that there were horrific rates of sexual abuse as well, rampant in the schools. And the intergenerational effects of those residential schools, I think, has been seen in Indigenous issues and communities for decades. But really, it's been only in recent years that we've been learning more about and connecting the dots. And so when I had this opportunity, when I learned this story about my father's abuse at a residential school, I wanted to do what I could to shine a spotlight on it. Mostly, I will say, like at the beginning, for my own, like for personal reasons, because it was such a difficult and painful thing to learn about his abuse by a priest at the residential school that he attended, that made me want to know more.
I will say before we go any further in this conversation, and I think that's something you mark out at the start of every episode of your podcast. Some of what we're going to discuss over the next hour could be quite upsetting for someone who's listening in. We are going to discuss issues of sexual abuse. We're going to discuss issues of discrimination. If you feel uncomfortable at any point, anyone who's watching or listening, please do whatever seems kindest for yourself at this point. Connie, I know that your reaction after the Peabody and the Pulitzer was you were quite shocked and surprised. But aside from those very richly deserved rewards, there was so much good that people had to say about this podcast. You got the DuPont Columbia Award, Best Podcast by The New Yorker, The Atlantic, Esquire. Did you have a sense while you were beginning to work on this project that it would build itself up into the phenomenon that it grew to be?
No. In fact, I think that for a really long time, actually, at the beginning of our reporting, I wasn't even sure that it was a story. I think that because I was so close to it, because this is such a personal story, I really, like, all of my own editorial instincts, I feel like were overshadowed by my personal feelings about what I was learning. So this all started really after reading a Facebook post by my brother Hal, and it was in the weeks after I don't know if you all remember, but there was a discovery of what's believed to be the unmarked graves of children at a residential school in British Columbia, at the Kamloops Indian Residential School. And that discovery made national and international news. But what was so significant about it was that it seemed like it was one of the first times that for survivors, they felt safe enough to come forward and start speaking about their experiences, because many of them had tried, speaking out about what they experienced at residential school and seeking accountability before, and they were often not believed. They were, there was, I think, so much hostility towards survivors for so many years, but after Kamloops, they started coming forward. And that is when my brother shared the story of my father and how when my father was in the RCMP in the 1970s in Saskatchewan, he pulled over a vehicle and realized that it was the priest who had abused him when he was a child at residential school. And I had not heard that story. And my father told my brother that he beat up this priest on the side of the road that night, and that he had expected to get into trouble, but nothing ever happened. And he never told him who the priest was or anything else about him. And it just became this kind of story that some people in my family knew, but I had never heard it. But when I learned it, it really kind of helped me understand things about my dad, because like many survivors, I think that he went through obviously like horrific abuse at that school, but that abuse plagued him for many years, even after he left. And I have done reporting on residential schools, but I at the start of this story, I didn't even know which school my dad went to or for how long or anything about his experience there. And so at the very beginning, I think that for me, it was really just like, a personal quest of a daughter trying to make sense of her father. And I really relied on my team to help kind of, I shape the editorial. I remember coming back and I was like, from my first reporting trip with these interviews with some of my relatives, because my father passed away. So I was interviewing his brothers and sisters who also all went to St. Michael's Residential School. And I was like, I'm really interested in this, 2-hour interview with my Auntie Margaret, but are you guys is this at all interesting to you? And it was hard to have a sense of whether or not it was even a story, honestly.
I can assure you it was, interesting is one word, but many, many other emotions when one is listening to it. You were also sort of recognized for your work by the Assembly of First Nations. And I found such a beautiful quote when they were applauding your work, saying, Storytelling is medicine for us as First Nations people, and Connie has dedicated many years to telling our stories in a good way. And that's the thing, you've been doing investigative work around Indigenous people for a long time now. Was it a natural draw for you as growing up? Did you see this as, almost like this was the path you were meant to take as a journalist, and these are the stories that you were meant to tell?
I would say that, like, yes and no. Like, honestly, like, I think that I had thought about journalism. And the first time I thought about being a journalist, I think I was in high school. And it was when a young First Nations woman who grew up like on a reserve not far from where I grew up was killed in Regina, Saskatchewan. And there were two white men who were on trial for her death. And I remember, like, I wasn't a kid who paid attention to the news, but I remember the headlines around Pamela George, because the newspaper articles called her a quote unquote prostitute and didn't say much else about her life. And so much of the coverage was focused on the two white men who were charged, and they were, I knew so much. They were university students. They came from middle-class families. One of their dads was a professor. One of them was a basketball star. The other was a hockey standout. And Pamela, and the way that she was talked about in the media, it was so dehumanizing. And I didn't have like the words to understand it, or I'm sure I wasn't processing it in the moment, but I knew what I felt. I knew that what they were saying about Pamela, they could say about me, they could say about my mom, they could say about my sisters, my aunties, and that this was an indication of how we were viewed. And that was the first time I thought about like what it would mean to be a journalist, and if there were any journalists, Indigenous journalists in newsrooms. But then I also remember feeling like when it was time to apply for university and there was a journalism school at the University of Regina, I felt like that wasn't a place for me. I felt like that's not an option for some, like I just didn't feel like that was an option for me. And so I didn't apply. And it really was like a few years later that I got connected with like an Indigenous communications program in the college that I was going to, that kind of started my career in journalism. And that year I became an intern at CBC, and I never looked back. And then throughout my early career at CBC, because I was at the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation for 20 years, I definitely was always interested in telling stories from our communities, but I also remember early on kind of shying away from it because I felt like I would be pigeonholed, and that the people who focused on our stories were not considered like real journalists. Like we were considered advocates or more than journalists. And then the other truth is that like for so many of my years at CBC and so many of my early years in journalism, there really was very little opportunity. I think there was this widespread belief that our stories weren't important and that Canadians didn't care about them. And, I pitched stories, and I remember, my one of my senior producers, like, just kind of stopping me and saying, this isn't another poor Indian story, is it? Like, I think those kinds of attitudes prevailed in journalism for a really long time. And so it wasn't until much later, like when I had then years of experience and honestly, like more ability to show and prove why this was important, and then to like have the proof be in the impact, that was when things started changing. Once we moved to digital media and we could actually show like, hey, this is how many times a story was clicked on about an Indigenous issue, and this is how many times it was shared on social media, and this is how many downloads we've gotten for this podcast. Then it was like, there is an interest, there is an audience, there is an interest. And that was, my experience at least. And I suspect that that's not unique.
What would you say you found the most discomforting in the newsroom as a journalist of Indigenous heritage, Connie? Because I'm sure there are people watching from very different parts of the world, but very similar experiences, as you said. What did you find the most discomforting in the newsroom? And then to have journeyed from there to actually setting up CBC Aboriginal, that's a difficult path to have traversed, I'm sure.
Yeah, I think that like the racism that exists in society is like exists in newsrooms, right? Like, and I think that so much of it is, at least around, in my experience, was around this like the prevalence of stereotypes, and that was something that those attitudes were held by editors, were held by senior producers in newsrooms, assignment editors, people who get to decide something. Like, I remember when I first started CBC Aboriginal, it was after this documentary series that we did called Eighth Fire, which was meant to be like this, one of the biggest projects I'd ever worked on that was focused on Indigenous issues and was very much supposed to be, a conversation around reconciliation following the work of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Canada. And it was the first time, I think, that, for Indigenous people, that we saw ourselves on primetime television in ways that were not, completely terrible news stories that were told about us by people not from our communities. Because every Eighth Fire documentary had at least one Indigenous producer that was working on it. And I was one of the producers on this series. And I remember just how powerful that was, being able to see, people that looked like my aunties or my grandma on TV speaking in our accents, and wishing that, like, I remember thinking, like, I was wishing that my grandparents had been able to see that, that was something that they could have experienced. But what happened after that was that, and it kind of coincided with this shift to digital media, and this was back in 2012, and it really helped connect Indigenous communities across the country in a way that was really, like, from where I sat, really powerful. And it made me think, like, we could harness this, we could show that this is possible. And so we came up with the idea for CBC Aboriginal, which was like a digital news site dedicated to Indigenous news across the CBC. So if it was on TV, or if it was on radio, if it was somewhere online, or if it was in a regional news story, like, we kind of just aggregated all of that content into one central place, and then also did some of our own original reporting. And, we were a small unit at the very beginning. I was the only reporter. I had a senior producer, and we were allowed to have other Indigenous reporters across the network for one day a month. And there were times when, in the beginning, when our page hits were beating whole regions, like smaller regions, like, Prince Edward Island or New Brunswick, but who had much larger teams and much, like, bigger numbers in terms of population. And I think that was when things started to shift. But I think that what I saw, or like what I experienced at CBC, was not, I think, out of the ordinary. I've connected with other Indigenous journalists, and I think, like, this lack of representation, the kind of stereotypes that persist about our communities is something that is, like, almost integral to the act of colonization, in a way, right? It's like, there's so much of our story, there's so much of our history that has never been told. And if it has been told, it's been told by people not from our communities. And I think that it used to be seen that, as an Indigenous journalist, that we have a bias, that we are not able to report on our stories in an accurate or fair way. And I think that what I've been learning, and what I've been trying to help show, is that our lived experience as Indigenous people is a strength to our stories, is an asset. It's like, we have the context, we have the lived experience to understand issues in a way that non-Indigenous people don't. And I think that is starting to change in Canada. I'm really encouraged by how much has changed in Canada, at least.
I want to go back to sort of talking about the podcast in specific, but it's an important point that you raise. Having done that, Connie, to your knowledge, how many other large mainstream news organizations, or even smaller ones, made that move to actually set up a space for Indigenous affairs reporting? And secondly, just as an extension of that, what do you think it's important for non-Indigenous reporters to know?
Mhm.
What are they not getting about this that they should while approaching these reports, while approaching these stories?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a great sense of how many other, sorry, excuse me, how many other organizations have adopted a similar thing. I know that when I was at CBC, we did have a couple of meetings with the Australian Broadcasting Corporation about similar initiatives that they were undertaking at ABC. I mean, I would love for that model to be adopted far and wide, because I think that it's I mean, long overdue for one, but I think it's actually like an opportunity for news organizations to build the building blocks they need for better coverage overall, because it can be used as a training ground for younger Indigenous journalists who are coming in. And that's certainly like CBC Aboriginal, as it started in 2012, has now changed to CBC Indigenous. And when I left the CBC in 2019, they had 10 reporters dedicated full time to their unit, and they were filing on all platforms. So I don't have a sense of how well it's been adopted, or other initiatives that are out there. But I think that especially for organizations like the public broadcaster that has this responsibility, I think, to cover Indigenous issues, that was a huge success. And I think that I think my feelings about how non-Indigenous journalists should take on Indigenous stories has changed quite a lot, honestly. I mean, because I have had incredible partners in all of the reporting I've done, and all of the reporting I did on missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls at the CBC was done with Marnie Luke, who was my producer, and Heather Evans, who was our senior producer / editor. And I think that it was so incredible to work with them, because throughout every story, I felt like we were building our knowledge and kind of the cultural competency that we need to take on these really complex stories and really complex issues, and those in-depth stories that you're often taking on in investigative journalism and podcasting. And so I think that doing the work of actually trying to educate yourself about that context is really important. I think as much as possible, helping to support Indigenous journalists to tell our own stories is something that we should all be working towards. We should all be making space for, and I'll be pushing for. I think that so many journalists of color were so hopeful following 2020, when there was this supposed reckoning in newsrooms about representation and the importance of meaningful representation and the commitments to diversity and inclusion. But I think that it's got to go beyond, having more people of color in your newsroom. It's like thinking about how to support them and how to train them, how to understand how our lived experiences are assets, but it also means that we have different connections to stories, often personal connections to stories. Every story that I reported on from an Indigenous community in Canada was a story that I had a personal connection to, whether it was water quality, because my community had been under a boil water advisory for years, that we weren't allowed to drink the tap water that came out of our taps when I was a kid, or housing crisis, which is again something that affects my family community, violence against Indigenous women and girls. These are all issues that are often some of the reasons why we're going into journalism. And that means that we should be supported to help tell them, but also that there are unique challenges to that as well.
Yeah. Let's workshop your podcast a little bit with sort of two questions. One, why a podcast? We're seeing a little bit of what's happening with Spotify, and we've gone from the excellent work that Gimlet has done to sort of news headlines like Gimlet was always going to end this way. And the second question is, I know you've acknowledged them, and there's been a lot of work that you've done with your colleagues in terms of interviews. Is it that truly deep investigative work requires a larger team? And I'm saying this speaking to a lot of independent journalists out there, probably very passionate, but wondering how to do this as a single man or woman show?
Yeah, I think those questions are really like really great together, because I think what's been happening in podcasting in particular in the last year is so concerning. There have been so many layoffs and so many teams and shows that have been canceled. And I think that it's made me more honestly like, I would love to continue to do this work, absolutely, in podcasting. I feel like, especially for Indigenous stories, podcasting is really the perfect platform, because I worked in radio and digital and television news for many years. But I think with podcasting, you have the ability to be immersed in a world in a way that I think allows for these connection points, allows for like you to create empathy for people that and to kind of counteract the stereotypes that exist in ways. And I feel like as soon as I started in podcasting, I felt like this is what I want to continue doing. I think that it's when In the Dark was canceled from 8 p.m. and that was a while ago, I was like, oh my gosh, if this can happen to In the Dark, that was a really troubling sign for me. And I think that what I'm feeling right now, looking back, is just gratitude for what we were able to do when we were able to do it. Because Stolen Surviving St. Michael's, we had so much support, in terms of our production team, but then also the ability to like bring on people as needed. Like one of the people who joined our team for that season alone was another Indigenous reporter who's based in Saskatchewan, who ended up doing a large number of the interviews with residential school survivors. And that was such an integral part of our entire series, and really made sense for somebody, local to be doing that. So another Indigenous person who also has that lived experience that she was bringing to those interviews. And I think, and I worry that that's not clearly not a sustainable thing for journalists. And I think that, like all investigative journalism, it's often the most expensive thing. It's often the thing that is difficult for smaller organizations or freelance or smaller teams to do, but it's vital in terms of journalism. And I think this decline, I think in podcasting is something that I'm adding to my concerns around the future of journalism and just what that's going to mean if it continues to shrink, and if we're not able to find ways to sustain and support it.
Yeah. There's also the issue of protection, and it comes in two ways. So let me deal with them separately, perhaps. The first is maybe easier, which is external. There was one interview where the person, and I don't want to reveal too much for people who haven't heard it, but the person says, when they heard the school was burning, it went quiet. And then one person started clapping, and then everyone started clapping. What were the dangers or challenges that you had to navigate, having put this piece out in the world, where you're dealing with representatives of the church? You talk about religion, you're talking about the ravages of colonization. Did you have to really kind of put up a lot of walls to protect yourself from external hate or aggression?
I think, no, I would say, I feel like I think that I have been somehow, and I should think about why this is, like knock on wood, I've been able to really somehow escape a lot of what other Indigenous journalists have faced. And I think I see some of the terrible racism that people have experienced through social media once their stories are out, and the kinds of emails they get, and it's horrifying. I feel like maybe it's because of podcasting, maybe it's because of the kind of nature of the story that we do. It's like I luckily haven't experienced very much of that. It's been a very warm, I think, reception from our audience online and on social media. I think for me, the biggest concern and worry was that I was telling such a personal story, and so many of the people in the story, at least at the beginning, like it starts out very much the podcast as my journey to learn about my dad's experience at this residential school, and in order to learn about that, I interview my aunts and uncles, his siblings, all of them who went to St. Michael's around 6 years of age, not speaking any English. And I think I was just really concerned about my family's reaction, how they were going to receive the podcast. And that was the biggest, I think, stress for me, because I wanted to, obviously, I didn't want it to be a painful thing. Like, I think that one of the things that the podcast has become for me is actually been this kind of way through to healing in a way. Like, I think, I've been lucky enough to spend time at the Dart Center for Trauma and Journalism at Columbia University. I was an Oxford Fellow a few years ago. And I remember like learning about the impacts of trauma and learning about PTSD specifically, and how to try to be more trauma informed in our reporting, but also how to try to practice self-care when taking on these stories. And one of the things that was surprising about that education for me, was kind of revelatory, honestly, I'll admit, was that telling your story in a way where you're treated with respect and that you have agency, and that you're given the space to do so in a meaningful way, can be a healing thing for people who have experienced trauma. And that's what I feel like this podcast has been for me personally. I obviously had so much support from my team, but I was the, managing editor of Stolen. I'm now the executive producer. And so I think that this has been like a really positive experience. And I wanted, for me personally, and I wanted to try to have it be similar for all of the survivors that we talked to, including those in my family.
That was actually the second part of my question, which was sort of protecting yourself and protecting those you were speaking to. You say it at one point in the podcast, and you address it as well, saying my own trauma was bubbling to the top. And through so many of the conversations, you can hear the tears, and you can hear the weeping when people are speaking. How, for someone who's even attempting to do a conversation which can be so heavy with trauma, what would you say are good and kind and empathetic steps to take as a journalist?
I think time is really honestly the biggest one. Like, don't have an expectation that people are going to, open up immediately and you'll get what you need and you can leave. Like, I think that all of those interviews were like very long interviews. I think one thing that we were deliberate about as a team was not asking for specifics about any kind of abuse or trauma, or if people were feeling like they were not comfortable talking about something, we never pushed, we never asked directly about some of that. I think also trying to they're in those interviews in particular about childhood trauma and about childhood abuse. Like, I think that we were talking and kind of bringing people back to those moments, and bringing people back to maybe things that they had tried to forget or tried not to think about for a really long time. And so I think that we always tried to leave people in the present, always tried to bring things back to now and into something that I think maybe was a reminder of the resilience that they've had, that they have left that behind and are now in this other place. And I think always continuing to check in on people, like, is something that we prioritized following those interviews. And then one thing that like I said, I think that I used to feel really, really badly, honestly, about doing an interview where someone's most painful experiences were brought up, because I felt like talking about it was harmful or was only going to cause them harm. That being reminded of that was like only a bad thing and a terrible thing, because you can see when people are talking about it, you can see the pain on their faces, you can hear it in their voices. Like if you're in the moment with them, like you can really begin to understand how difficult those experiences still are, even if they happened years or decades before. And the thing that I would say or think to myself was that, I'm trying to be as careful and sensitive as I can be, and that this is for a greater good. Like, this is so important for people to know or understand the truth about what happened in residential schools, or if it was a case of a missing or murdered Indigenous woman or girl, like, that the families, it was so important for them to help raise awareness about their loved one who was missing or whose murder was unsolved. And that there was this public interest in this story, and that therefore it was worth it. And then again, through the Dart Center and through some of my own education around trauma-informed journalism, I realized that it can be a helpful thing. Like if you are somebody who is an empathetic listener, and you're giving space for someone to share their story in a way that they are feeling respected, and that is not inherently a bad thing, that can actually be a helpful and healing thing. And I think that is something that has been like, now that I feel that, I feel like I've seen that consistently, and that was something that I kind of witnessed, I think, through the Missing and Murdered Finding Cleo season, where we followed a family who was looking for their sister Cleo Semeganis over several months. And I remember wanting to be so protective of them when the podcast came out, and really limit the chatter on social media, because this was their real life and this was something that they had gone through as children. And then I remember being so surprised when they engaged with every tweet and every Facebook post and thanked people for listening, and that they were feeling this empowerment of having shared their story in a way that they felt good about. And that, to me, honestly, was just such a lesson and really inspiring.
Yeah. In some part, it's sort of echoed in what happened here at the Institute, Connie. A dear former fellow, Bridget Brennan, who I think has joined this conversation. Hi there, Bridget, if you're there. She has worked on a project around Indigenous representation in Australia. And I remember her sharing with me that I think what she found so powerful was speaking to people from Indigenous communities from other parts of the world, really hearing so much of it echoed back to her. I am conscious there's a room full of journalists with questions for you, so I'll ask you one more and then, move to them. You ask your survivors about it, and I want to ask you what it means to you as a reporter when you ask them about accountability and justice. Is that something you carry on your shoulders when you begin a project like this, that your work should lead towards accountability and justice? And what does that look like to you?
Yeah, I mean, I think that initially it wasn't, like with this story about my dad. Like, I heard the story of him being abused at residential school, and it made me want to learn more about his experience and better understand, how that shaped his life after he left the school, and how that shaped the dad he was to me. But I remember thinking about it, like, if we were going to do it as a story, like not being sure like what the shape of that story is, and feeling like it might be, again, like not interesting to people, like this was, I was concerned about that. And then one of our producers, Anya Schultz, she said, why don't we try to find the priest? Like, whatever happened to that priest? Was he ever held accountable? Was he ever charged? Where did he go after he left St. Michael's? Like, how easy would it be to find him? Like, and that honestly was like, maybe it seems like that was an obvious thing, but at the time I remember being like, oh my gosh, this eureka moment. Yes, absolutely. Like like, so much of the narrative and the discourse around residential schools up until that point, at least in my life, had been around healing from trauma and like, how do we reconcile and what is reconciliation? And none of it was really focused on justice or accountability. And that is something that, like, having now gone through the whole podcast and then, we start out looking for this one priest who abused my dad, but very early on, like, we hear the names of other priests who were alleged abusers. And then we decide to expand the scope of our investigation and not just look for my dad's abuser, but to try to understand how much abuse was happening at the school, because what we were hearing from survivors was like shocking almost, even as somebody who's reported on residential schools before. And what we were able to uncover is something I just had never expected in terms of the scale of the abuse, like over 200 allegations over decades of sexual abuse of children. And I think that became the motivator. And as we were doing it, I was like, this is so hard. Like, the stories of survivors is so difficult, like understanding, connecting the dots of my own family in terms of like, how the abuse has passed through generations, because the children who were abused at residential schools went home, and some of them perpetuated that abuse over and over again in families and communities, and feeling the weight of that was so devastating. But always, like, I felt like having that quest for accountability, having that quest for wanting to understand the truth, having that motivation was such, like, I needed it in the end. Like, it was so important for me personally to be able to get through that. And then it's a thing that I'm left with. And like, how can it be now? It's like 2022 when the podcast came out. Like, the last residential school closed in 1997. St. Michael's closed in 1997. And it took that long for us to take on the story. I just had so much regret that I didn't do it sooner, that I wasn't able to, like, look into this earlier, and now like that we should be doing this for every school, like every single school. There were over 100 across Canada. How many were in the United States? This system of residential schools was replicated in other countries around the world. Like, how, like, these investigations should be happening now, because the window for accountability is shrinking. It's like, for survivors, like my father's brother, my Uncle George, we interviewed him for the podcast, and he passed away before it came out. Like, every week and month and year, we're losing survivors. And we're also, the people, who perpetrated abuse against these children are also, aging and dying. And although this week, actually, a priest, an oblate priest who worked in Indigenous communities in Canada, pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 2 years in prison. And I can't remember his exact age, but I believe he's in his 80s as well. So I think, this work is urgent and it should be continuing.
Indeed. Let me switch across now to our room where all our fellow journalists are waiting with questions. I want to start with this one because I think, it's something we haven't raised before, but there's no name against it. The question about local reporters and the fact-checking process, perhaps we could start with, whoever's penciled in that question. I don't have a name there. Omar, is that your question?
Okay, yeah.
Go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much. My name is Omar Zomre from Burkina Faso. I would like to know, with how many local reporters did you work with on that project, and how many of them were indigenous people, and how did you manage to fact check all the information given? Because this was related to church, and we know that accessing to church data is sometimes very complicated. How did you manage to get the accuracy of the story that you told?
Yeah, those are great questions. I mean, we had the one reporter who was local to Saskatchewan, Betty Ann Adam, and she is Indigenous. She's Dene from northern Saskatchewan, but also her own family has experience with residential schools. Her mom was a residential school survivor and has been dealing with the legacies of residential schools and reporting on them for years. Betty Ann actually has a beautiful film called Birth of a Family, which is about her family being reunited because they were all part of the 60s scoop. So they were apprehended by child welfare authorities and adopted out into white families as part of this program. Anyway, so Birth of a Family is an amazing film that Betty Ann did, as well as her work on our podcast. But, I think that it's absolutely it's so difficult. I think you're right, to be able to report on historical sexual assaults, for one, because especially when they're crimes against children, they are not reported often to police. And as far as we were able to tell, there was even though we uncovered what we did in the end, there were, as far as we were able to tell, never any police investigations into the sexual abuse of children at St. Michael's. Very, very few police investigations in general. Most of them have probably happened in the last, 5 to 10 years, actually, in terms of abuse at residential schools. And the other thing is that, because I think these schools were funded by the federal government, but operated by the churches, but the Oblates, the Catholic order of priests who ran St. Michael's, kept very, very detailed records. So there are attendance records going back, to the late 1800s, like some of the earliest students, and details about who was at the school and how long they were there, exactly how many nights they were at the school per month, because that was their accounting. That's how they then received their money from the federal government. They had to submit these reports. So there's so much meticulous record keeping in terms of the archives the Oblates have around how they ran St. Michael's, but none of it says anything about abuse. The only kind of inkling we got about what was happening at the school to the children there was, looking in a priest's folder that had been turned over to these archives. We asked for the personnel records for the priests, and we were told that they're going to be sealed until 50 years after the priest's death. But we were able to look at some personal folders, and in one of them, I found negatives for this priest who we had heard abuse children. And there was a photo of boys undressing in a locker room, in this pile of negatives. But none of that was none of the abuse was in the archives. And so we were hearing these stories from survivors of their abuse. And we know what has been revealed through the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, how widespread physical and sexual abuse was at the school. But we wanted to be able to name these alleged abusers. We wanted to name as many as possible. We wanted to just shine the biggest spotlight we could. But for legal reasons and journalistic reasons, we had to make sure that we could be comfortable with the legal risk that is associated with naming people who have not been convicted of crimes, because there was never any police investigation. And so what happened was that in the podcast, we kind of detailed this. We outlined the whole process. But what we were able to do was access lawsuits. So survivors started coming forward in the kind of 90s and early 2000s with their experiences in residential schools and suing the Canadian government and the churches for the abuse they experienced. And there were so many lawsuits that it eventually led to the residential school settlement. And we were able to access some of those lawsuits, and that's how we were able to report what we did, which is, naming and many of the priests and nuns who we name in our podcast, had not just one allegation of abuse. For so many of them, it was multiple allegations at different schools, because they sometimes moved around, and it was also sometimes abuse that occurred over a long period of time. But I hear you in terms of the difficulty in doing this kind of reporting.
The next question is from Shobi from Singapore. I think you've answered part of it, but Shobi, go ahead.
Yeah, it's actually a follow-up to your question about why podcast. I was just wondering, while podcast is a very good tool and a very powerful one, especially if you want to protect your interviewees, are there certain points when you were doing the interview that you feel very handicapped, such that perhaps with visuals, you could have told the stories even better?
I worked in TV for a really long time, so I have experience doing television interviews, and I have found that the level of intimacy you can have with a microphone alone is really incredible, honestly. Like, I think that, you try to make people feel comfortable in front of a camera, and certainly there are many, many skilled people who are able to do it. But, if you're setting up a light, or if you're worried about a shot, if you have a camera there, like, especially I found in Indigenous communities, like, that can be a very difficult thing to kind of overcome, is like feeling like the camera's there, the camera's on me. And I have felt it too, it's kind of this imposing thing. But with audio, that's one of the things I love about the format, is that there is this intimacy, because you're hearing someone's voice, like it's and they're in your ears, like they're actually, it's like, and you're taking them in the most, in your house, you're like, you're doing all of these really intimate things, and it feels like this kind of this level of intensity that I have been so drawn to, I think, in audio, and also just the portability and the accessibility. Like I think it's I mean, we're talking about how expensive investigative work is in general, but in terms of podcasting, I have a microphone, I have a recorder. I usually, like this is the recorder that I take, and I has a mic attached to it. I don't have it here because I was tracking downstairs. But it's really an accessible medium. You get a digital recorder, you have a microphone. There are so many programs now that make it easier to like record your own podcast, and I love podcasting. Not to say I wouldn't love to do more documentary work. I mean, who knows what's going to happen, but.
Yeah, you don't know where a Pulitzer and Peabody takes you. The next question is from Christina. Christina, you have two, so I'm not sure which one you'd prefer to ask, but the floor is yours.
Oh, I can't hear.
I can't hear you. Your audio is muted.
Okay. Hi, I'm Christina. One of the questions I had was in reporting these stories, especially ones about your own family. How did you balance making sure that you communicated the impact of trauma, especially the generational impact of trauma, and making sure that you weren't adding to sort of these stereotypes and negative stories that you've talked about wanting to counter in terms of Indigenous stories?
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I'm just curious how you balanced the real impact of trauma in these communities and in your own family, and making sure that you weren't sort of adding to negative perceptions or stereotypes.
I that's a good question. I think that it's difficult, obviously, but I think again the kind of nature of the story we were doing, in terms of how in depth it was, but also how like how fulsome, like we were able to like include in terms of like the community and family, so that it's like you're not just telling a story about like the sexual abuse of children. It's like, when you're immersed in a podcast, you're traveling with me, and we're with my aunties who went to the residential school, but we're sitting outside and we're having coffee, and the kids are playing in the background, and we're laughing along through the tears. Like, it's not one dimensional. I feel like you're able to kind of present the complexities and all the different shades of gray. Like it's not this black and white thing. And I also think that like, because this was a personal story for me, excuse me, and I was able to include some of my own experiences with the intergenerational trauma, that was something that I heard from people was impactful, that this is like, I'm the journalist, I'm the person that some people have been listening to all of the seasons of my podcast at CBC and now at Gimlet and Spotify. And so, for me, it was important to share my own experiences with childhood sexual abuse, because it was part of telling the bigger story of how this continues to impact families and communities. And I think I felt comfortable doing that because, again, of the agency that I had in the telling of this story, that I knew that this was not something that was, sensationalized in any way, that this was something that we were taking care in terms of reporting on, and we were trying to be as sensitive as we possibly could. But those are, I think, things that you're able to, like, I recognize the privilege that we had in being able to take some of those measures and to think about things. And we had so much time and space, and to have really thoughtful and meaningful conversations with our team about how we were going to undertake that, and what we were going to try to put in place to ensure that we were being responsible and sensitive and careful. And that's a luxury that even now I think has changed for me even.
I think some of the other questions have been answered. So I'm going to go to Maxine, who has a question about how the collaboration worked with the podcast producers. Maxine.
Hi there, and thank you for your podcast. I think I've listened to it all in about a day and a half. It's amazing. So I'm interested in how working with Gimlet worked, like whether they were there from the beginning, and on such a personal story, what impact they had, and just how that all happened.
Yeah, I was already working at Gimlet. I had joined Gimlet in 2019 after I left CBC, and the first season I did with Gimlet of Stolen was a podcast called The Search for Germaine. And so we were looking for the next season when I heard the story about my father and decided that I wanted to take it on. And at the time, the managing director of Gimlet was a journalist called Lydia Bolgreen. And it was my first time having another person of color as an editorial leader in my work. And that was honestly a game changer, because I have felt like I've often been in positions where I have to prove to people why something is a story and why it's important, and why the average American or average Canadian is going to care about something. And I think Lydia got it immediately and was one of our biggest champions and supporters throughout the process, and was also just in terms of providing editorial guidance and leadership, just so available. And it was really an incredible experience. I was really sad when Lydia left the company. But I would say that it really, the entire experience at Gimlet was incredible. I come from CBC public media, where I feel like we're all used to doing as much as we can, more with less, and the budgets feel like they're shrinking every year, and it's getting harder and harder and harder to do this work. And I think I just happened to join Gimlet at a time where I still don't really even understand it, but there was just so much support. It was what do you need to help tell your story, which was such a wild thing for me, where I was so I feel like I'm so honestly just so grateful to have been able to experience that. And the other part of it, I think, is that we were able to have that editorial support from senior leadership in the company, but we were also, it was the first time I had worked with two other Indigenous journalists on a podcast. I've never worked with another Indigenous producer on any of my podcasts or in any of my stories at the CBC. So I think having, Betty Ann, Chantal, and I, we all have different experiences. We're all bringing our full selves to the story. And I think that just made it that much richer and relevant.
I think it's a great tee up for a final question, which has come online. And I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. It's Ayode Olatokeva, who has a question saying, thanks for being so real, Connie. Have you ever experienced getting tired of being a journalist? Or
Tired?
Yes, tired. Or the feelings
Yes.
of getting old on the job, or kind of stuck? And what do you think should be a better option? If you had any way to tell these stories, Connie, would you choose it, or would you still choose to do it this way?
I mean, absolutely. I think, yeah, I have been tired many times. I think that for so long, like, I really just felt like I was hanging on by my fingernails. I was, I felt like I was, you know, not feeling that fulfilled in the kinds of stories I was doing and not really sure what I wanted to do. And once I think things started changing in terms of being able to tell more stories that I really cared about and tell more stories that I was really passionate about, that's when things started changing for me. And since then, like, I think I've just kept like adapting. I was like, oh, I was a TV news reporter, and then now I'll be working in this documentary unit to work on Eighth Fire, and then following that, we should start this digital unit. And so then we did that, and then it was like, oh, the network wants more of this reporting. So then I was a network reporter for a while, but then I became really interested in I feel like I've been lucky to like have other opportunities present themselves and be willing to say yes and be willing to honestly like fail. Like some of my early forays into hosting live radio were painful, very painful. And same with like reporting on TV, and same with podcasting. I mean, I think that so much of it is really just trying to be willing to say yes to the next thing. And I definitely feel like, I mean, I have this feeling now where I'm like, they're letting me do it. I've just got to keep doing it for as long as I can. Like, I kind of am waiting for the other shoe to drop, or feeling like this could go away at any minute. I don't actually think that, but I have that instinct still. So I'm like, I've got to do it for as long as I can. And I feel like there are more stories that I can tell, and that there are more stories that should be told. And that to me, I think is a personal mission, because I care about my family, and I care about my community, and I care about and I'm speaking of like my family back home in Saskatchewan, and this is, I feel like, my way of like helping or wanting to try to help.
Connie, it's been an incredible conversation. Thank you so much for taking time out. One final question, because there's so many coming in, which is, what is the best way to reach out to you? I think there's a lot of people who would like to hear more from you. How should they do it?
Sure. Yeah, I'm on social media way too much. You should see my screen time. And I have two phones, so I'm like, it's very bad. But I'm very active on Instagram and Twitter and Facebook, and those are generally, honestly, probably better ways to reach me than email, because my email is so overwhelming. I find it difficult to keep up, and I just don't like email.
You prefer Twitter? I can't believe that.
I like how quick it is, and you can just like respond with like a couple words, whereas an email you have to be like, hello, thank you for your, like, it's just, I know this is terrible. It's like, it just feels like so much work sometimes to even respond to a single email. I have issues.
Well, don't we all? Thank you very much, Connie. It really has been such a pleasure speaking with you. And I think so much of what you say is...
Thank you very much for having me.
Let you
it was
go
a pleasure
now.
to join you.
Yeah, we'll let you go now. And for everyone who joined in as well, we'll be back next Wednesday. So see you then. Bye-bye.
Bye. Take care.